Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Wim Liu. You are listening to the Hello and Welcome podcast presented by Betway. Just got back from the press conference involving MLSE President Keith Pelley, who confirmed the news that MLSE has officially parted ways with Raptors President Masai Ujiri. I have to say this, but former Raptors President Masai Ujiri. In a whirlwind of emotions today. Even for myself, I'm genuinely still a little bit in shock of the news that Masai will no longer be leading the Toronto Raptors after 13 years at the helm. So many questions to get to, including what do we actually learn from this press conference by MLSE President Keith Pelley? What do we learn about why Masai was let go? What we need to know about who the next president of the Raptors will be, because there will be replacement for Masai. That seemed to be the one and only thing that Keith Pelley was willing to answer, was that there will indeed be another president of basketball operations here with the Toronto Raptors, unlike what he's done with the Maple Leafs. For example, I want to ask the question of what's next for the Toronto Raptors as well, because quite frankly, today was not supposed to be about Masai being let go and all the turmoil that has come out since then. And then lastly, I really just wanted to say a couple more words to say thank you to Masai on his way out, because I think he really deserves that after all this time here. He genuinely has mine and many other Raptor fans true admiration, both as a person and also as a basketball executive. And having spent so long here in Toronto, 13 years, the fact that he wasn't even given a chance to hold a press conference to say goodbye and leave on his own terms, that doesn't sit well with me. I understand sort of how these corporate, firings go, that, there almost always isn't that chance to be given the graceful send-off unless you're walking into retirement or something. In this case, I think Masai will continue to operate in basketball. But nevertheless, given his significance to the city, I'm telling you, if Masai Ujiri ran for mayor tomorrow of Toronto, he would instantly walk away with that role. But it does feel like it is such a shame and it is such a surprise, even though there have been hints, even though there may be clues, even though the ownership change with Rogers officially taking over and buying out Bell and taking over majority and controlling shares of MLSE for the first time, well, I guess ever. This still feels so shocking because of the fact that we've had so much permanency and long-term management under Masai Ujiri, who we have come to grown as a symbol of the Raptors, maybe more than any other person in the organization. Masai Ujiri had become that symbol of the Raptors, and now he is gone. So again, just coming back from the press conference, just trying to collect my thoughts, just trying to share some of what I have found out and sort of what other people have reported in this time. So let's start first with Keith Pelley and the press conference that he held, impromptu press conference at 1 p.m. In Toronto at Scotiabank Arena. I was able to get a chance to get a couple of questions in, but more importantly, I think it was just a good time to understand exactly why this whole situation needed to take place. And I'm going to tell you before I even play you some of the key clips here that I don't have a clear idea of what happened here today, why it needed to happen today, and also I don't think, first and foremost, if you step back and look at what's the goal of a press conference, especially of this kind of caliber, the goal is either to A, provide answers, or B, to provide confidence. And usually the answer should provide the confidence, because otherwise you're mostly just lying or perpetuating something. But ultimately, the goal of the press conference is to project confidence. And especially when you have such a big seismic shift, I did not personally come away more informed of what happened and be more confident of that this was a benefit to this beloved organization in the Toronto Raptors. So let's get to a couple of the clips. The first one here.
Steve Simmons, Toronto Sun. Did you make this decision, or did Edward Rogers make this decision?
This was my decision, supported by the board.
That was the first question that I thought was, of note in terms of just what the direction of the team was. And then here's another one here.
Brain from The Athletic. Keith, you said you spoke to Masai a month ago or so. Was that when he was told the change would be happening?
I think Masai and I have been chatting for probably the last couple of months, last 2 or 3 months, about the future. And so we've had a number of conversations over that time.
And when was he told firmly this was the decision?
We talked earlier at the beginning of this month.
And what were your impressions of how he took that news?
I think Masai is a professional, and so he took it as such. And I think that Masai, no doubt, will be speaking in the coming days, and you can ask him that question directly.
There you go. So, first and foremost, we have since got reporting from Brian Wolstead of Toronto Sun, who said, quote, a source Friday said that Ujiri had been told of the decision on June 9th. And after that, it was all about the details of the split. June 9th is about 3 weeks ago now, as compared to the news dropping here today on Friday, June 27th. That means that they've had well over 2 weeks to actually plan this exit. And obviously, us as reporters, we did not get the wind of it. So I guess they did a good job of at least keeping it in secret. But more importantly, I think that having had this much time to go towards this decision, you have to do a better job anticipating the questions of the fan base, the concerns of the fan base that you'll be looking to address in a situation like this. Quite frankly, if you see the initial reaction, and this is not just my opinion, this is the widespread reaction by Raptor fans, especially that I've seen, the widespread reaction is, number one, why did Masai get let go, which was not provided. There was no answer from that from Keith Pelley. And number two, what are we going to do next? And where are we going to go from here? And of course, there were answers in terms of there was a reassurance that there would be a future replacement at GM. It seems like they've contacted Creative Arts Agency to lead the charge into finding a future successor. We can talk about that in a little bit. But I think for me personally, this was not a press conference that inspired confidence in the organization and in the future of this team. And quite frankly, when you're talking about press relations, especially at this level, when you have such a big decision, you need to sort of strike with something that has confidence. I think that it's not a rare thing in sports to have regime change. I think what's more rare is to have something like Masai, who had a 13-year run consistently in one spot. That's more rare. But when you do have regime change, I think the good organizations do a great job of projecting that confidence, and they assure to the fans and assure to even the people within their own organization that there is a sense of confidence rolling forward. What we do know, for example, is that the Raptors at least made sure to go ahead and extend Raptors general manager Bobby Webster and also Raptors assistant general manager Dan Tolzman. Those two, I've been told, have been largely the ones leading the draft. Dan is always very, very involved in the draft. That's something of a specialty for Dan Tolzman, and I don't think it's a surprise that we've heard from him twice in the past week. On Monday, when reporters were able to speak to him at practice on Monday ahead of the draft, and then on Wednesday after the second night of the draft, he got a chance to speak. Also on Thursday, sorry, he got a chance to speak again in regards to the second round, largely, after the drafting of Elijah Martin with the 39th pick. So those two have been the ones largely running this draft. However, one of the explanations given by Keith Pelley was also that, weeks ago when they were talking about this, and I'm not just talking about June 9th when it was informed of the decision that, MLSE is going to move on from Masai, but even before that, many months ago, probably at the end of the season, when they were talking about the future in terms of whether or not Masai would stay or go, Keith did mention, and in his opening statement, which, by the way, he did read from a piece of paper, because before the press conference came in, a press officer actually put the paper on the table, and then that way Keith Pelley can walk on the thing with no papers in hand and then occasionally look down. If you watch the press conference, especially in that opening statement, he looks down several times. There's a piece of paper with almost a script there. In that script, you saw him discuss the idea of the fact that Masai himself wanted to stay on beyond the draft because of the fact that this is something, Masai just cares for the organization and everything like that. To me, that actually raised more questions. Number one, if you feel fit to let go of Masai and move in a different direction in terms of your top leadership in basketball as a Raptor organization, why would you then also let him run the draft? That doesn't feel consistent, because not only this year's draft, I mean, this year's draft was very significant because there's always a lot of trades. You heard some executives and even just based on all the movement that took place prior to the draft, this was almost like a second trade deadline of sorts. You had the actual trade deadline in February, which again, Masai was pretty prominently involved in that. And then you come in a couple months later and you have the draft, you have another second trade deadline, essentially. You saw the Raptors rumors coming out there. Raptors are in for KD, Raptors in for Giannis, Raptors probably want to move IQ, they probably want to move RJ. Maybe Yak was getting involved, although it seems like now they want to keep Yak. You have all this sort of take place, in addition to the fact that you have the 9th pick, you have the 39th pick. If you don't feel confident in Masai Ujiri anymore as the president, you feel like there's a better way to run the organization, why are you letting him run this specific portion of the year? For me, that's an inconsistency, and that was never quite addressed or explained by Keith Pelley in this press conference. In fact, most times Keith Pelley referred to the same thing, which was that he sees the stability. There's a value in that stability in terms of, you still have Bobby in place. You have Bobby actually under a new contract. You have Dan Tolzman extended, all these different things. You have, Darko in place. The roster he mentioned was pretty much in place, just at the line of the luxury tax. So it seems like everything was in place, and that's why they felt fit to let go of Masai. Well, in that case, why did you put that man who built this whole thing, right? He brought Bobby here. He brought Dan Tolzman here. He brought the players and the coaches here. If you value stability, why would you let go of that thing that was holding this thing stable? To be honest, I just don't think that the answers were fully addressed in that sense. And again, I can't stress this enough. If we've been thinking about this move for months potentially, or officially for weeks, 2 weeks at least, before the decision was made public today on Friday, which, by the way, classic news dump on a Friday, a long weekend coming up. You dump the news that you're firing Masai with the hope that people are going to just forget about it over the long weekend. It's a classic media training move to do this on a Friday. A lot of questions and, quite frankly, a lot of inconsistencies that I walked out of this press conference with. It didn't feel like Keith Pelley, aside from addressing a couple items on his piece of paper, didn't really feel, again, he just didn't really address largely the questions of what's happened here, why it's happened, and what's going to happen going forward. That has led us, obviously, to try to do our own thinking, our own fact-finding about the future. I think the first question that you have to ask, and I think that it's a fair question, is, why did Masai get let go? I think that, number one, and I think maybe largely the biggest factor here could just be a factor of money. When you look at the bigger picture of what's happened since Rodgers has taken over majority control of MLSE, whether that's behind the scenes, whether that is on the lower levels, all the way up to the president of their organizations, whether that's the Leafs, the Raptors, TSC, etc. The one thing that has been pretty consistent has been a lot of layoffs. I'm obviously more partial because I work in media, so I know some people in the media side. But even just after the Raptors season, actually towards the end of the Raptors season, I think in April, there were hundreds of people laid off from MLSE. Now, granted, part of this could just be a merging of two organizations. And when you have sort of one of these big takeovers, one of these big corporate takeovers, one of the inevitabilities will be that people will ultimately have redundancies, and the companies will see that there might be more value in streamlining, quote unquote, which largely means, making things more cost efficient by letting people go. That's just the reality of sort of corporate takeovers in general. So at that point, I wasn't wholly sure if this was just one consistent pattern or not. However, there's no redundancy in the president of the Raptors. There's no redundancy in the president of the Maple Leafs. And I'm not a big enough fan, and I don't follow the Leafs enough to understand that one. But at least that one, they've chosen to just go without the president title. In this one in Toronto, it's part of the reason why there's a lot of speculation, and not just from me, but just from, widespread, is that Masai Ujiri was going into the last year of his contract. And he did have $15 million owed to him next season. Now, granted, if he does take a job with another team in this coming year, I actually think that, that the way contracts are structured, I don't think the Raptors, I guess, themselves wouldn't be on the hook for the 15. It'll just be the difference between what he's paid in the new place versus what he's paid here in Toronto. Whatever. That's a separate thing. I think the main thing could just be the money, though, because even when Masai was coming off the championship at the height of his career back in 2021, negotiations at that time were pretty difficult. Remember, we actually went through whole rounds of sort of discussing this, and there was a great piece in the Toronto Star by Doug Smith where they actually explained and went into the details of what went into that negotiation, what took so long, and quite frankly, one of the voices of concern was Edward Rogers and the fellow seats on the MLSE board. There's I think 9 seats at that time. He had 3. There were concerns from the Rogers camp in terms of how much money Masai was going to command on the next contract. $50 million is a lot. Granted, it is certainly one of, if not the largest president sort of pays, salaries in the NBA. That's one thing. But ultimately, if you go and read the reporting at that time, there was a lot of concerns from the Rogers end in terms of how much Masai was making. And ultimately, it took Larry Tannenbaum, who at that time was kind of a tiebreaker between Bell and Rogers, and also Bell were pretty strongly in favor of keeping Masai. And so they had the votes at that point to give Masai that previous contract. Obviously, now you have the ownership takeover. Rogers now holds the majority of control of MLSE. And so it's basically their decision. So you could already see coming from a mile away that once the contract will come up again for Masai, it will be a difficult conversation. So again, it could largely be about a money thing. Now, granted, this answers almost itself when the Raptors ultimately decide to hire the replacement for Masai. If that person, and by the way, they, Keith did say that they want someone really experienced, somebody with, I don't know. I think largely experience was the main thing he said. But they definitely want to continue to hire someone in that place. We'll see. I will just predict right here that person will not be making $15 million or anything close to that. And therefore, at that point, you can look at it as a cost-cutting measure. Of course, Masai would have to, very few people go in and just run out the remainder of their contract. You decide almost a year out. Are you going to keep going with this, or are you going to split? And obviously this summer was sort of that discussion. And quite frankly, it seems like they've chosen the latter to split. Another potential reason why Masai could have been let go was just, we've heard this a couple times, but just, the Masai behind the scenes in terms of just the, quote unquote argument that they had other interests in mind. Usually what they mean by that is that obviously he spends a lot of his time towards philanthropic efforts. And honestly, some of those are very much supported and even funded at times in part by MLSE. Quite frankly, I've heard that argument before. I myself personally will not make that argument. I don't think necessarily that's fair because I have never seen a situation where, and I don't know any situations or any specific involvements where Masai had put his personal projects ahead of the Toronto Raptors and his job there. And if I had heard that, then I could understand this. But unless there is the specific documented instance or even just reported, situations of this pattern happening, it is not fair to put that on him. And quite frankly, I've seen that elsewhere. I understand the speculation. I've heard that speculation too. So if the people are just sharing that, that's okay. But I just generally think it is not fair to say that unless you have documented cases of where Masai had put his personal projects ahead of his job as a Toronto Raptors president. But that is something that I've heard, and that's just largely what I would like to express here. I think the third option that I see potentially in terms of why did Masai get let go was just the performance. Was this a performance issue? Because quite frankly, the Raptors in the last 5 years have not been as successful as the Raptors in the first 7 years of Masai's tenure. If you look at the last 5 years, they made the playoffs once. They lost in the first round in 6 games to the Philadelphia 76ers. Quite frankly, that series wasn't even that close considering the Raptors were down 0-3. And then they had another year where they made the play-in game, and of course they infamously lost that play-in game that is known as the DeAndre Rosen's screaming on the free throws game. Was one of the most embarrassing collapses to finish one of the most embarrassing seasons from the Toronto Raptors. Since then, that prompted them to change out the roster pretty significantly. You saw Fred VanVleet walk in free agency to Houston. The Raptors did, by the way, want to retain Fred. They offered him a 4-year, $114 million contract. You know what? Especially now that Fred has now re-signed in Houston for 2 years, $50 million. Turns out Fred actually made more money and made the right decision to walk in that scenario because he got 2 years of the max at $40+ million and an additional $25 million. That is actually more money Sorry, an additional $50 million. That's actually more money than what he made in Toronto, even before the fact that you can factor in Houston and the lower state income tax versus here in Toronto. I don't even want to get into all that. Fred walks, right? I think that there was a real sense that OG had his eyes elsewhere, and he ultimately went to the New York Knicks. Quite frankly, the Raptors, I've asked OG this before, and I asked him, did the Raptors ever offer you anything close to what the Knicks signed you for? And I say this, he laughed and walked away. So I don't think that was ever on the board for OG. And then finally, Pascal Siakam, who has since gone on to do some great things elsewhere, which, by the way, does not necessarily look great on his performance here in Toronto in terms of just how that whole situation was handled. But that one, I understand that there were some personal issues that sort of frayed, and that was specifically between Masai and Pascal. I actually think Bobby was not involved in that one, but there were some personal issues that sort of bled into that exit. And quite frankly, as a Raptor fan, given the fact that these are two of the most important figures in the organization in terms of just in Raptors history, that personally does not make me feel good. And I don't necessarily see why it had to get to that point. Even at minimum, if you could have re-signed Pascal and chosen to move off of him in a future time, I think you could have gotten a bigger return than what he actually ultimately commanded at that time to Indiana. But there was that. I think there was also obviously Nick Nurse leaving the organization. That I think probably has more to do with Nick than anything else, especially towards the end. Nick kind of committed what I would say is one of the more flagrant offenses as I've seen as a Raptor, where he publicly speculated in Philadelphia that he might not be in Toronto long term. This was in the midst of a playoff chase, and he just publicly said that. And of course, no surprise, he ends up in Philadelphia. That was one of the more shameful things that I've seen. And to be fair, it really does taint my thinking and my value of Nick in long term as a figure in the Raptors. I'm thankful for the championship. But my point is, there's a lot going on in that stretch. You also heard about all the turmoil between, how Scotty didn't necessarily see eye to eye with some of the veterans at that time. I mean, there's just enough turmoil in that season that I honestly think that even though I don't think this is a direct result of that, I think this is an offshoot, a lingering fallout from how poorly that 2023 season went. But you saw some signs. Obviously, the Raptors have not been a particularly effective team. I mean, they have not been competitive in the last two seasons while they've pivoted towards a tank. Maybe I think going forward, they will be more competitive. I like a lot of the draft selections that they made. I like the Brandon Ingram trade. We'll see sort of what else they do with the roster. I could certainly see that they have pivoted and they want to move forward. And quite frankly, they do hold important assets moving forward. So it's not like they're out of picks or anything like that. But it could also just be a performance issue. And if I were to say it on that level, there are issues that have taken place. And I think those are legitimate gripes that you could say that, you know what, even though there probably is blame to be had on the player side, on the management side, maybe it's just bad situations all the way around. Maybe it's just the Raptors never had enough money to keep everybody. Because if you look at it, you don't have the money to pay Fred 40. You don't have the money to pay Pascal 40. You don't have the money to pay OG Anunoby 40 and also then pay Scotty 40 and Jakob 20 and all this kind of stuff. But ultimately, that is a fair argument. But at the same time, I think it's a contradictory argument because if you feel that this person is no longer fit to run your organization, why would you extend the courtesy to have him run the draft for you again and have him run the trade deadline for you last year as well? It's just, it's not just the draft itself, but even any potential trades that could have taken place. Because quite frankly, the Raptors were not just, making the 9th and the 39th pick and going home. They're also fielding calls at this time about, hey, would you trade this guy for this guy? Would you trade this pick for this pick? Those are all key decisions that, again, if you no longer felt confident and this is a performance issue, why would you then let Masai come through all this, right? To me, that is a real contradiction. So I'm really curious. I still don't have a definitive answer as to whether or not Masai deserved to be let go or sort of why Masai specifically was let go. I did ask Keith, one of my own questions was just that, was there any indication from Masai that he was interested in leaving and potentially this was sort of a more of a mutual split? He obviously answered just basically that, like, I should ask Masai that question. Well, guess what? I probably will see Masai in Summer League, and I hope I have good enough of a relationship with Masai to get a more clear answer on that. And hopefully when it's a couple weeks from now in July, in the middle of July, I can come to you with a little bit more clearly on an answer on that front. The next biggest question is who's going to be the next Raptors president? And This is what we know. So Keith says that the Raptors will be using CAA to lead the search. That they have already submitted what they're looking for to CAA. He really didn't give much clarity on sort of what specific parameters he was looking for. He did say often that there will need to be somebody with experience running in this role. So we'll see sort of who that person is. One candidate is Bobby Webster, the general manager of the Toronto Raptors, who for the moment is the top dog for the Raptors in Toronto. He did get a contract extension as part of this decision. So it seemed like they, again, moved behind the scenes to secure everybody else in place, but then let Masai sort of get pushed out the door at the end. Bobby does have a contract extension in place, and he will be considered for the role of president. I think part of this is that really does need some clarification, and it changes organization to organization. But specifically, what are the differences between a general manager of a basketball team and a president of a basketball team? And I think broadly speaking, the president obviously is the one in the very, very top. And so they run everything. That doesn't just mean running the organization of the team in terms of the general manager has to deal with the contracts of the players, the contract of the head coach, and also maybe just a general team strategy building, maybe managing of some of the specific relationships between the players, although those largely fall under coaching as well. The president of the team has to manage not just the basketball portion, but has to manage all the staff, has to manage the ticket sales, has to manage the larger team identity or organizations. Probably, Masai was vice president. He was going to New York to take the league meetings that take part in those. I think that basically the president role does include pretty much everything that the GM does, but also all the other small things that come with being the boss of the team. So I do wonder, quite frankly, Bobby, to me, in my experience with him, seems to be somebody who is focused on the basketball side. I think he enjoys the team the team building aspect, the scouting aspect, and specifically being able to fit all those things together, the aspect of fitting everything into a puzzle, which is the knowledge of the cap, which is the knowledge of the landscape in the league. I think all those things are the ones that he's really good at. Quite frankly, I don't know. I know he will be in consideration for this president role, but I do think that his best job is probably just being the general manager and probably having more clarity to just team build rather than to have to deal with the whole thing and be everyone's boss like president. But ultimately, they are going to be looking for an experienced name. I'm thinking they probably have to have someone with cachet because, quite frankly, you are coming in to replace a tremendously popular president here in Toronto and also a tremendously successful president here in Toronto, Masai Ujiri, and that does make it a pretty difficult job to step into. This isn't exactly like taking over for like the Knicks, who have been terrible for many years before Leon Rose and his organization came in. That's relatively easy. Yes, there's pressure, but quite frankly, you're not being compared to anything. I think this is actually a really difficult job for anybody to step into. And so I think in that sense, not only do they need experience, but they need somebody who is going to have the confidence to run the organization in a place that will be always compared to the standards that Masai set it at, which is a championship, which is going to the playoffs year after year, which is to be one of the most popular sports entities here in Canada. And I think that those are some pretty difficult heights to reach. If we just talk about just the executives who have had championships over the last 10 years, I only see two that are potentially available or that aren't currently employed by the NBA in the last 10 years in terms of organizations who have won championships. Who are those top executives that the Raptors could potentially try to get? I don't think you can get any of the following names. Sam Presti. There's no way you're getting Sam Presti. OKC, he's just not leaving OKC. Trust me. Better teams than the Raptors have tried to call from Sam Presti in better situations. He's not leaving. John Horst, I don't even know the Raptors should call him, quite frankly, because the Bucks don't look that great. But ultimately, they just extended John Horst. He's not leaving. Tim Connolly, which I'm going to give him the credit, not Calvin Booth, because Calvin Booth was officially the GM and the top man in Denver when Denver won in 2023. But that roster was built by Tim Connolly. He, I think, is pretty much rooted in Minnesota, is even with the new ownership change on that front. But I don't think that the Raptors can get Tim Connolly either. Rob Pelinka is very cemented with the Lakers. And again, I don't totally know if people really want Rob Pelinka running the Raptors. And past that, obviously Masai in 2019, beyond that, there is Bob Myers, who was the architect of the Golden State Warriors. He has since gone on to do ESPN for the last year or so. Pretty prominent position there. I think there was also some discussions of he went on to consult for the Washington Commanders. I don't follow the NFL enough to really know that, but I do see him on ESPN literally yesterday on the draft, and the day before that on the draft, and in the finals. So he seems to be probably the most popular and maybe the most visible candidate to be, again, interviewed for this position. And really, if you go back even to 2016 with David Griffin and with the Cavs, I guess he's also available because he was just fired this past year by the Pelicans. Although, granted, I would not say the Pelicans were well run in the slightest. But it's pretty hard to see somebody with a championship resume in the last 10 years who could step in and sort of replace Masai. Really, again, the two available for me are Bob Myers and David Griffin. We'll see if those names end up sort of popping up. I do think that it's interesting that CAA specifically, I mean, CAA is a huge agency. There's no doubt about that. But CAA specifically leading the charge, it does make me think, well, maybe it's not necessarily just one of the managers or one of the executives under that side. Maybe it's one of the agents, because we've seen this recent trend in the NBA with guys like, Bob Myers, who actually was a former agent himself, Rob Pelinka, who used to be Kobe's agent. You've seen Leon Rose. Obviously, he was big CAA. Trust me, man. Him running the Knicks. We are seeing this trend where more executives are being made out of former agents. In that sense, that there are some pretty prominent CAA agents that currently have lots of clients. I think the top two right now are Aaron Mintz and Austin Brown. I wonder if those names ultimately got thrown into the pool in terms of if the Raptors choose to replace their president with an existing agent and hire from that realm. That does seem to be part of the popular trends, but we'll have to see who the next president is. I think that there is a decent chance that Bobby ultimately just takes on that role. I think at that point, it'll be really difficult for them to counter the idea that, wait, was this not a cost-cutting move if you just got rid of Masai and then you just promote Bobby? I think that's the optic side, and I would totally understand that argument. On the flip side, I do have a lot of confidence in Bobby in terms of the way that, I've seen him interact with rival GMs. I've seen him interact with the top agents in the league. There is a level of respect. I've never heard anything that was really a negative experience. Certainly, I've heard some gripes necessarily with how, and not even gripes, but just kind of like bristles about how the way Masai sort of operated. I've never even heard one time anything about what Bobby operated as. But then again, that's Bobby as a number two rather than Bobby as a number one. So you never know sort of how a person could change in that scenario. Ultimately, you're not really going to be complaining about a number two. You'd be complaining about number one. So that will be a real question. I think I also asked, is there an urgency to sort of really improve the roster? Keith himself actually tried to pivot that conversation towards more of there's not an urgency to find the next president. He said it could take a month, it could take 2 months, but ultimately they're focused on trying to get the right man. So we'll have to see ultimately. I do have some questions furthermore on just what is going to be happening to the Toronto Raptors in the meantime in terms of what's next, just straight up for the team. I would say for the immediate thing, first and foremost, one, today was not supposed to be us all talking about Masai and what's next for the organization and hearing a lot of Keith Pelley, which, by the way, if you close your eyes and listen to the way he sounds, he'll sound like someone quite prominent, if you just know what I mean. But if today was supposed to be about the fact that the Raptors have brought in two new players into the organization through the 2025 NBA draft. It was actually funny going down to Scotiabank Arena. I saw this gigantic picture on the mega screen outside of Scotiabank. And for people listening on the podcast, it is a graphic that they have shown with Colin Murray-Boyles and Elijah Martin. And it just says, "Welcome to Toronto." It was a very funny thing to see that as I'm walking in through one of those doors to go into the press conference when they're actually letting go of Masai Ujiri. From what I understand, actually, not from what I understand, from what I can confirm, both of these people are actually in Toronto. Colin Murray-Boyles is in Toronto. Elijah Martin's in Toronto. I actually saw Elijah Martin and his family visiting the CN Tower earlier today. Okay, so these people are in Toronto. They were supposed to be announced, and this was supposed to be an introductory press conference. That obviously had to be superseded with the fact that Masai got let go today. And so I'm being told that the plan is right now for them to be unveiled at a later date, probably in Las Vegas Summer League. So this will be at least 2 weeks from now. Summer League starts on July 10th. So that's the current plan, is to unveil them at a future date so they get knocked off in terms of just their prominence. Again, today, day after day 2 of the draft, you've probably seen lots of top prospects go give their interviews, go get their press conference, take their photos, hold the jersey for the first time, everything like that, shake hands with their GM and president. In this case, we'll see you in Vegas in 2 weeks, but it was actually just kind of funny seeing those guys. Apparently they're already in the gym for the Raptors just in general, and working their way in. Obviously they will be part of Summer League. So yeah, they're in the gym rather than getting pictures taken first and foremost. I think the other thing in terms of just what's next for the Raptors, I am really curious in terms of, say a major opportunity pops up, say a star asks out and they say, in this hypothetical scenario, hey, I want to go to Toronto, all right? Or there's a big trade available, somebody comes in and says, I want to give you multiple picks for RJ Barrett, or I want to give you this player for Emmanuel Quickly. A decision of that scale, especially with no president just yet, I do wonder how this is going to happen. I mean, I trust Bobby and the remaining leadership staff in place to be able to make the right decision. It's not about the question of whether, I trust them to make the right decision, but I do wonder, this is a pretty unusual time in the limbo period between when the Raptors fire Masai and also hire the next president. I do wonder how much autonomy and how much opportunity the Raptors' current brain trust is allowed to entrust and actually make these decisions on. Of course, typically speaking, if you're making a big trade, right? Let's say you're trading Scotty Barnes, for example. Doesn't matter if the Raptors have a president or not. They would have to present this case to the board, and the board, not all, votes on it necessarily, but basically just, have to get the okay. Like when they traded DeMar, for example, they had to explain it to the board. They got to get the okay. And of course you had to, you then get the green light to make the move. So I'm not saying that there's a level of total autonomy, but I do wonder how much autonomy, because this is a pretty important time. It is free agency coming up. And I know the Raptors are not going to be big players in terms of signing people in free agency, especially with the roster as is. I think, depending on sort of what they do with Elijah Martin's contract, whether they want to make that a two-way or make that an actual just, regular, second round salary. I think depending on sort of what path they take on that front, I actually do think that, the Raptors are probably not going to sign anybody. But again, a big trade happens right now. What happens? Because right now the Raptors are in a very big period of uncertainty. So, that's probably really confusing to me more than anything else. Again, you've heard the Raptors name come up so often in trade rumors recently that it's a very fair question, in my opinion, to ask who's actually going to be, well, not just who, but are Bobby and Dan Tolzman, are these guys allowed to make big decisions as they come up? Because again, it's not like this happened in August, late August, when nothing's going on in the NBA. You could take your time to hire a new guy, but your roster's set, your coach is set, whatever. You're going into free agency right now, and you don't have a president. And by the way, it does look chaotic to the outside in terms of, in the midst of all of this, you have such a big leadership change. If the Raptors want to just keep the roster as is, fine. You probably have an easy time. But quite frankly, do the Raptors want to keep their roster as is? That's a big question. And I guess I'm just curious whether or not they can make those changes as needed if they were in a more period of relative calm in the organization. So last thing, and I know I've rambled on a lot here, but I just really want to say a couple words of thank you to Masai Ujiri. I'm going to tell you why Masai will always be a legend here in Toronto. And I just want to express, not just for myself, but even on behalf of Raptor fans, if I can even try to attempt to do that, just try to express gratitude towards Masai, because as you have seen from the reaction, the overwhelming reaction has been anti-Rodgers, has been especially anti-Keith Pelley, who I, again, did not think he, spoke with confidence in that press conference. I mean, my goodness, the amount of times I've seen Masai sit in that chair and deliver quote after quote. That's the same press conference zone in Scotiabank where he infamously sat with Kawhi on one side and Danny Green on the other side. And he said, believe in yourself, believe in this city. Believe that we can win a championship here and see the opportunity in this city. I've seen Masai give presidential level speeches on that stage. To go from that to seeing Keith Pelley pop out and read off a piece of paper and refuse to really answer any questions in depth and be evasive, it's going to take some time to get used to, first and foremost. But I just want to say a huge thank you to Masai, because I think he deserves it. And number one, I want to say thank you for all the wins. You know, if you've heard Masai press conferences over the years, his go-to phrase is, "Sports is about winning." It's about winning, and he would almost say this to the point where it became a meme, right? I think part of the legendary story was that one of the reasons the Raptors, were so enamored with Scotty Barnes, his personality, is because when they did a draft interview with Scotty, he mentioned the word winning dozens of times. And so how important this is for Masai. Masai just says this over and over again. Well, guess what? Thank you for the winning, Masai Ujiri. The record for the Toronto Raptors in the time before Masai was a cumulative record of 581 wins versus 847 losses. That is a 40 win percentage. At that point, the Raptors had only made the playoffs 4 different times in their entire time. This is over the span of 18 years. They had only made the playoffs 4 separate times. Their season high in win totals, they achieved that twice in 2001 with 47 wins. This was under Vince Carter. And in 2007, this was under Chris Bosh. Those times, they both tied for 47 wins, but ultimately they went 581 and 847 in that time. They had not won even one 7-game playoff series. They had won one playoff series officially, and that was a 5-game series that they won all the way back in 2000. They had only made the playoffs 4 times. That was the organization that Masai was stepping into at that time. So when we're talking about winning, and you look at what Masai and the Raptors did under his watch, the Raptors went 545 wins with Masai against 419 losses. This obviously is clouded by the fact that the Raptors tanked the last 2 seasons and also the Tampa season, because prior to that, they had made the playoffs every single year. But 545 versus 419, that's a 56 win percentage. That is good for one of the best marks in the NBA. At certain points, the Raptors actually were the most winningest team in the NBA over 5-year stretches. And of course, you talk about the fact that the high watermark before was 47 wins in the regular season. The Raptors in his first year, and almost even by accident, won 48 games in the first year Masai took over. And then it went to 49, then 56, then 51, 59, 58, 53, and 19. That year, the Raptors actually were on pace to crack the 60-win mark for the first time ever. That was the year COVID happened and the year was shortened. But ultimately, they still had 53 wins in that time, 53 and 19. That's honestly one of the best win percentages the Raptors ever had. They replicated 48 wins again. They did 41. And of course, there were 3 bad years. 27 and 45, that was in Tampa. 25 and 57, that was with the tanking. And 30 and 52 with tanking. Outside of those, I mean, you look at it, that's 6 times that the Raptors had finished above the previous high water mark of 47 wins. The Raptors under Masai's tenure made the playoffs in 2013, in 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, and it was a consistent stretch that was only interrupted by Tampa, which again was a shortened season in a once-in-a-lifetime scenario where the Raptors had to relocate their whole goddamn franchise to a whole different city that did not care about this team. They consistently achieved new heights year after year, whether that was sending multiple All-Stars to the All-Star game, winning multiple awards, whether that's, Rookie of the Year, whether that's, All NBA awards, whether that's Coach of the Year awards, whether that's Sixth Man of the Year awards. Raptors became this organization that won things for the players, but won things for the team overall. They won their first 7-game playoff series finally in 2015-16. That year they went to the conference finals. That was, at that point, a championship onto itself, was getting to the conference finals. They started attracting, obviously, bigger name players to join the organization. A lot of that was through trade, because free agency, quite frankly, was never going to work out in Toronto. But even through trade, I mean, the names that started walking through the door, man, Serge Ibaka, Marcus Saul, Kawhi Leonard, these are just instant legends that have made their mark in Toronto and that were brought here under Masai's watch. You look at the type of characters that, were here before, with all due respect, Kyle and DeMar weren't Kyle and DeMar. They weren't really anything in Toronto back in 2013 before Masai took over. And I will give them all the credit in the world for working themselves into the players that they became, because that's not just a change in leadership. That's their work. So I will always give Kyle and DeMar their props for what they did. But those guys became stars in this tenure. And then the Raptors made their own stars. They grew their own stars out of nothing. We're talking about Pascal Siakam with the 27th pick. We're talking about OG Anunoby with the 23rd pick. Norman Powell with the 46th pick. Fred VanVleet undrafted. And of course, when the Raptors went back to the lottery, they got good players. Jakob Poeltl with the 9th pick. By the way, part of the Jakob Poeltl miracle is that they traded off of Andrea Bargnani, who had a bad contract and a even worse reputation, and probably one of the most detrimental players in the league in terms of how much money they were being paid and how much usage they were getting versus how little production they were getting. They turned that into Jakob Poeltl in the first place from the New York Knicks. That actually inspired the Timmons said, "We believe in Masai" viral video, which I've seen trending again here today. We grew our own stars, man. I think that to me was really beautiful. And we made great trades, and eventually we culminated all of that into a championship. That is still something none of us really ever envisioned. So I think first and foremost, I want to say thank you once again to Masai for the winning, because as Masai always said, sports is about winning. And he did a lot of winning here in Toronto, more than any other executive in any of the major sports teams in Toronto since, I guess, the Jays in the 90s. We're talking about a 30-year period of futility for the Jays, futility for the Leafs, who, by the way, Leafs always first-class citizens for MLSE. Raptors always second-class citizens for the Raptors. And, of course, the Jays are their own entity onto themselves. But it really went, Leafs, Jays, then Raptors. And honestly, for a long time, it was a big gap before you got to the Raptors. When the Raptors were good under Masai, Raptors were right there with Leafs in terms of prominence in the city, and I would even argue even above the Leafs in prominence when you look at the overall valuation of the organizations in terms of just what they're valued at. So, Masai, thank you for the winning, first and foremost. I want to say, too, thank you for giving us a sense of confidence and a sense of swagger. If you watch The Last Dance, with the documentary, obviously, about Michael Jordan and his last season with the Chicago Bulls, there's one scene where Michael Jordan has a cigar in his mouth and a baseball bat in his hand. And, of course, this is like the most MJ sort of style scene. And MJ's talking about it takes a good man to be talking shit when they're down or when it's tied versus being able to talk when you're up and ahead. And I think that's a pretty crazy statement and it's very accurate because, quite frankly, most people, myself included, will talk a lot when we're up versus when we're down. It's a little bit harder. And the reason I bring up this story is the closest I ever thought Masai had was to being let go was after he did the summer of 2018, which in Raptor circles is basically our red wedding, right? He's fired Dwayne Casey at that time. He was winning Coach of the Year. By the way, he received that Coach of the Year with no team attached to him. A little bit embarrassing for Dwayne, but ultimately, beloved figure. Masai really loved him and I really admired him, but he let him go. And in that same summer, they let go of DeMar DeRozan and they swung for Kawhi Leonard. And again, I refer back to that same seat where Keith Pelley sat at today at the press conference at Gate 5 at Scotiabank Arena when Masai sat in that seat and he gave his infamous speech of believe in yourself, believe in the city. That's what it means when Michael Jordan says it takes a good man to talk shit when you're down or when it's tied. Because the Raptors were not winning at that time. More than anything else, the Raptors were a great team, and we all could see that. But there were so much doubts in terms of did we do the right thing? Why do we bring in a rookie head coach who at that time was just Dwayne's assistant for a long time? Why do we take away DeMar, who's our leading franchise scorer and a beloved figure? And why do we flip him out for Kawhi? Why do we alienate Kyle, which obviously he was so close with DeMar and DeMar felt so personally hurt? Why do we alienate Kyle? It was not easy to bring in 2019. It took a lot of leadership to do that. But more than anything else, it took a lot of vision. And then when I think back to that quote, that is going to be if they put and they do right by Masai, which is to give him a figure somewhere in the city, hang a banner somewhere in the arena, put his name somewhere in the arena, somewhere very prominent too. Like, I think he deserves that, considering the Scotiabank Arena or ACC hasn't even seen one other championship in that building since it was built in like the early 2000s. He deserves to have his name put up there, and the quote that should be put up there should be "Believe in yourself, believe in the city." It takes a good man to give us that swagger, and that's the one thing with Masai's too. Is just a lot of executives can make good trades, could make good draft picks, build good teams, hire good coaches, make a winning product that people will come watch, right? But I think it takes a true person and a true leader to make you feel a love and connection to the product that you're watching. And whether that was Masai's first ever press conference when he said we won't be caught in the middle, whether that was Masai in the first ever iteration of Jurassic Park, going out there with Tim Lewicki in the crowd with the mic in his hand, smiling, giggling, the little Masai giggle that he always gives, and then standing up to the crowd and says, "I got one thing before we go back inside. Fuck Brooklyn." And then he walked out, dropped the mic, everything like that. Got the fine from Adam Silver, by the way, which whatever, happily paid by the organization, and riled the fan base up. That was the Masai at every single turn, where he gave confidence and he breathed confidence and life into an organization that, again, when he took over, bottom five organization in the NBA. No one cared about the Raptors. No one respected the Raptors. No one admired the Raptors. And quite frankly, outside of Toronto, people didn't even like the Raptors or care about this team. He made people believe and care and built an identity off of that. That, to me, is a huge sign of leadership. So thank you, Masai, for the confidence and the swagger that you brought to this organization. I think also I want to say thank you to Masai for having the bravery to lead and be himself. Part of being a leader is if you are able to be true and honest with yourself and present that to other people, that will create the space for other people to feel the same way and to act accordingly. And I always thought Masai, even though you can always find gripes over 13 years, I'm not saying that it was all perfect. Again, you could even quibble with how the direction of the team has been managed in the last 5 years. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the way he purported himself as a person, both behind the scenes and also in front of the camera. And as one of the most public, visible executives in definitely all of Canadian sports, but even all of just sports in general, the fact that Masai, you look around the league, you look around management around the NBA, name me one other African executive at a top, position in the major sports, right? How many, you could count on maybe 1-2 hands, how many, African-American executives are even out there. And I think that Masai, more than anything else, was not only proud to represent, but I think he took it on his duty to represent and speak on injustices that he felt that he saw in the world and that he personally tried to direct attention to and to raise efforts in his charities through the Raptors and also through his own personal organizations in Janser Africa and beyond to open more opportunities for people. I'm not saying that he is this political figure that is rallying grand scale change. But I do think that it takes a real confidence and bravery from an executive to always speak from the perspective of somebody who is a minority, is an immigrant. And I think that especially in a place like Canada, where only over half of the country, in terms of the people, were not born in Canada or came to Canada seeking a chance to sort of build their lives, I think that resonated and spoke to people. And I know that for myself personally, I can definitely say that because I can count myself in that group. And I think it was really brave for Masai to do that. I think it was really brave. And it's very unfortunate that he was racially profiled after winning the championship in 2019. I've told this story a million times, but me, okay, wearing a similar outfit right now with a credential that does not have the NBA credential. It was just a random game credential. I was able to walk onto the court, cross the ropes, get on the court, take videos and pictures of the Toronto Raptors lifting the podium in Oakland. I had no issues. Nobody stopped me. I walked in, no issues. The fact that Masai, who is a million times more prominent, a million times more visible, a million times more known, gets stopped and he gets accosted and he gets that moment ruined for him by being racially profiled. The fact that he turned that and was able to direct attention to the situation that happens every single day, the situations that happen to people less fortunate and less, just prominent than Masai. I think that was really important. I think his love of, and support for all things African basketball, the way he's raised opportunities for people, the way that he spent so much of his own time, his own money, his own efforts. Most executives, yeah, you're busy throughout the whole year. You're scouting, you're managing your team, you're making trades, you're making, whatever. But quite frankly, people take vacation in August. People take vacation in September. That's the offseason for the NBA. August in September, I would say Masai's even more busy than he is in the regular season. He spends all his time that he has free making those efforts and building courts and building the sport of and building the infrastructure of basketball in Africa. And I think that, yes, that's not necessarily a directly initiative that falls under the title of Toronto Raptors general manager or Toronto Raptors president. But I think we can all take something inspirational from that, right? If we make it big in our lives, do we want to give back to create more opportunities so other people from back home, from where we're from, can have a similar outcome and ultimately just share in some of that prosperity and share in some of those opportunities? I think that speaks to anybody with a kind heart. And so more than anything else, I think that it was really rare to see that. I don't know many other GMs and executives who put that much time and effort and put that much of themselves into it. There is an infamous story from back in the day when Masai got his first ever job as GM running a team that was Denver. In those conversations where he was negotiating to get the top job in Denver. And by the way, this is, again, before Masai ever became a GM anywhere else. So he had no resume at this point. This was about to be the biggest job he ever got. And he was talking about ownership, and he said, I won't take this job unless I can get an extra $50K that I can throw towards charitable efforts. He was trying to launch Giants of Africa back then. This was like in 2008, 2009, I think, in that range. And even back then, you saw that vision before he was who he is now, with all the prominence and all the connections and, getting, Barack Obama on his side to unveil courts in Kenya, or getting a farewell message from, Drake and Justin Trudeau. Before he had all of that, he was already on this tip. And I think that you have to admire that, man, because I think that, again, a leader isn't necessarily just always telling you what you're supposed to be, but I think leading by example. And I think Masai, with how open and how charitable he was in his personality and how much he was willing to stand up and vocalize things, even if they were difficult, that to me is a real sign of a leader. And I think it was a really rare quality that you don't see. And I challenge you to name one other sports executive that had the heart, I guess, that Masai showed. And then lastly, I think, it's weird to say this, but just being fun and open, man. I know Masai's not dying. Masai's going to go and get other jobs in the NBA. It looks like Atlanta. I think he probably already interviewed for Atlanta. We'll see if he takes that job in Atlanta. We'll see if he takes the year off, collects the last year of his contract from MLSE, and then ultimately goes to Seattle, where it seems like Tim Leiweke, who previously was the Raptors, I guess the MLSE president before Keith Pelley, by the way, gave a much better press conference than Keith Pelley. I don't think it's fair to compare between the way Tim comes across versus the way Keith comes across. But maybe he just goes and follows Tim, and Tim hires Masai again to run the next organization, maybe in Seattle, right? That's also a possibility. Who knows? Masai has a lot of chances to keep working, and I think he has, a lot more to say in the sport of basketball, especially in the NBA level. So again, it's not like he's dying. He's just obviously no longer the Raptors president because we've pushed him out, apparently. But I do want to say thank you for just being fun and open. It was, most GMs, most presidents kind of behind the scenes, low key, don't really give press conferences, don't really say much, try as much as possible to hide. I think the Knicks, since Leon Rose took over, I think they've had one public press conference. The fact that we even get this much regular access to Masai to sort of speak on things, for him to sort of take ownership of things, I think it's kind of rare. And then I think more than anything else, just speaking to my own personal experiences, I always found this man to be very, I guess he had no reason to be nasty to me. I don't think I've really given a reason to, but pretty fun, pretty open, if you catch Masai on a one-on-one and you ask him, your deepest Raptor question of, what happened with Kawhi when he walked, how did you get Kawhi to come? What happened with that 2023 team? Why did Fred, Pascal, OG, Scotty not work out, Nick not work out? Honestly, he'll probably just tell you. And I really respected how open and how transparent some of that was. Now, granted, that's his perspective. I'm sure that if you ask the other players themselves directly involved, they might have a different perspective. I'm not saying that it was always, hunky dory. In fact, towards the end, it wasn't. But I did respect that. And again, I respected that, you can just share a laugh with Masai sometimes, that you can just, feel, I guess, personable and even sometimes eye to eye with somebody who obviously has such a big profile and such a big stature. So, I guess what I'm trying to say is I'll miss him as the person running the Raptors organization, not just as the leader in the organization, figurehead running the team. So, yeah, I mean, there's just a lot to say thank you for. And again, I really didn't think that today would be about anything other than the two rookies. I was looking forward to telling you what I've learned about Colin Murray-Boyles, what I've learned about Elijah Martin. That can wait until next week. But right now, that's what we know. Circling back today on the shocking news of Masai Ujiri being let go. So we will definitely follow the story. We'll obviously be covering and seeing sort of what the Raptors do from here. Again, I will have to state that I do have a lot of confidence in Bobby Webster and Don Tolzman, both of those guys, to continue running the organization in the meantime, especially in the day-to-day, even some of the bigger things. I trust them to do all of that. I think those guys are very talented people. I think they're really smart. I think their track record also has been pretty good. And I think that even if it's not now in Toronto, I think that they will get opportunities to run teams. And I'm hoping that that's just the chances just for them to keep running the Raptors as is. But even thinking back to this, it is a huge change. And I do think that when you have something like this happen, it's not even just me as in media asking the question of sort of like, where do the Raptors go next? I think even for a lot of people in the Raptors organization, they'll be asking themselves, what do we go next? What are we doing? And where do I stand moving forward? And so it'll be a time of change, a time of uncertainty, and hopefully we'll be able to report as much of it as possible. But for now, thanks everyone for listening. This has been the Hello and Welcome podcast presented by Betway, and we'll be back to you next week when we hear more news. And if not, then we'll just talk about some of the prospects that the Raptors have added. So thanks everyone for listening once again. And once again, thank you, Masai. Wish you the best.